Hello and welcome. This week we're going to be covering understanding social problems. I love teaching this class if only because the diversity of these subjects is incredible, and each one of these subjects is really its own field of study. But if you look through the book, we're going to be covering problems such as unemployment. We're going to be looking at crime and criminal justice system, looking at things like eating disorders, then jumping over and talking about environmental issues, and then 2 minutes later we're talking about social stratification, the ways we divide into groups by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social class, location, all of which is associated with those. We're going to be looking at age and ageism. We're going to be looking at same-sex marriage and other sexuality issues. We're going to be looking at poverty, substance abuse, sexual behavior, the education system, work and economics, health and healthcare, urbanization, war and terrorism, and basically all the isms: racism, ethnocentrism, sexism, heterosexism, and again, ageism. So it's a very complex class because we're talking about numerous variables, all of which are associated with the functioning of society, conflict in society, and how society is socially constructed through symbolic interaction. It's a wonderful class. It's not necessary to have necessarily taken a sociology class, but again, we are in the sociology, the sociological study of social problems, which means we're going to be looking at how systems and structures and institutions are associated with the well-being of groups of people in general. We're going to be looking at how groups of people define what are social problems and how that changes with time. We're going to be talking about social problems that we've addressed as a society and those that are ongoing. And so it's a ridiculously complex way of looking at things, but that's sociology. Sociology is very complex because at first it seems like, easy answers. But the more we talk about these subjects, we realize that they're all interrelated. All these variables need to be accounted for to account for the functioning of society and problems in society and how society is socially constructed. So again, the whole idea of the sociological perspective is looking at how society, everything outside of your head, structures you, whether it's your culture or the socialization process, or the groups that you belong to and how that structures your life, or the institutions in society such as the education system and the media and government structure your life and the well-being not only of people but also of Earth itself. And so again, what is sociology? Sociology is the study of society. What's a society? It's a group of people. But to understand groups of people, we have to understand everything about people. So that means everything from the biology of our bodies to the psychology of our minds and the neural structure, the also biology of our brains, to the external context, the social context, which not only includes humans, but it also includes everything else on this planet that we are also interacting with, whether it's the air or whether it's animals or marine life or the water. So again, it's very broad at first, but that's kind of the beauty of it all. Sociology is this macro approach. Yes, we are looking at micro groups, small groups, but again, the origins of sociology, again, is that big picture science that's able to combine all of the sciences into one. Again, how are we going to understand environmental issues if we aren't talking to the biologists who are out there studying the earth, So again, we need to be able to relate to all fields, whether it's biology, physics, psychology, sociology, political science, history, anthropology, the study of cultures. We need to bring all of this together to really be able to address social problems. Again, how are we going to understand poverty if we don't understand the history of capitalism and the division of labor and the dividing into groups based upon your social class location, which is then associated with your overall socioeconomic status, and your socioeconomic status is then associated with poverty, and poverty for not only individuals, that's the psychology, but poverty for groups of people, that's the sociology. So again, it's a complex class, and that's the beauty of it. So as you're going through this class, start thinking about the topics that really intrigue you, and those might become your passions, or at least something you can do for a final project. I know for my master's degree, I highly focused on social problems such as racism and classism and ethnocentrism. And then for my PhD, I really focused on gender issues and differences between sexes and sexuality. And so, whatever it might be for you, depending on what you're interested in, no matter what, this class will relate to it and the field of study that you're involved in. But again, as you can see, just by flipping through the chapters, we're going to be covering a large number of topics. But again, it's an introduction to social problems to get you thinking about all these things. And we're taking that sociological perspective, the sociological imagination, the intersection between the individual and society, groups of people. So, to begin, the book talks about what is a social problem and how do you define it. And so, straight out of the book simply says a social problem is a condition or behavior that has negative consequences for large numbers of people and is recognized as a condition or behavior that needs to address. So again, if we just go back from slide to side, think about unemployment. How does unemployment have negative consequences for large numbers of people? Think about the Great Depression. Think about we live in a capitalist system, and in order to be able to eat, you have to be able to get a job, to be able to make money, to be able to make capital, to be able to access either the means of production or at least the means of subsistence. Think about something like the environment. How does the environment have negative consequences for people? Think about the financial costs and the costs on lives. Think about pollution problems and how that affects lung and heart problems. And then you can take intersections such as race. Why are minorities more likely to live in environmentally unfriendly places than non-minorities, for example? And so you start to put these variables together. Think about problems associated with age. How does a growing population associated with negative consequences for people? How does age associate with health and health care and access to health care? How is age associated with social inequality? Who's most likely to be in poverty? By groups, by age, children and people that could be identified, depending upon the politically correct term, as elderly or older. Again, children and people that are elderly have the most high rates of poverty. And so, again, and then when you look at poverty by factors like biological sex, who is more likely to be in poverty, a female or a male? Why is a female more likely to be in poverty? And again, then we can look at things like inequality when it comes to gender and the feminization of poverty. And so, again, let's just look at a few more. Look at substance abuse. How is substance abuse associated with negative consequences for groups of people? Look what's happened with the opioid epidemic. Even though drug abuse has gone down as a society completely, drug overdose deaths are going through the roof. And you can look at graphs and see when doctors started to overprescribe opiates, the addictions and the levels of overdose death increased. When the doctors were held accountable by the government structures because it was determined that it was a social problem for the doctors to be overprescribing opioids, all of a sudden you see this skyrocketing in drug overdose deaths because people couldn't get the pharmaceutical opioids, so they switched to street drugs which contain fentanyl, which then increased almost 3 times as many of the overdoses. And so again, that's just taking several variables like the government, doctors, and drug abuse death statistics, and then again, who's most likely to be using drugs in the first place? What social class do they live in? And so again, this whole class is like just taking all of these variables, being able to put them together, and then apply them to an overall social problem, whatever it is you might study. If we were going to look at the education system, for example, how is the education system associated with negative consequences? Well, depending upon the school you go to and the neighborhood you live in and your parents' socioeconomic status, that's associated with whether or not you will graduate or not. And whether or not you graduate is then associated with how much money you make, because people that graduate college on average make twice as much money as someone who graduated high school. Therefore, the people that are going to the good schools that are getting the college degrees are making more money than the people going to the bad schools not getting as many college degrees. And if you're born in poverty, that's associated with the education system you're exposed to and whether or not you graduate college. And so again, just taking educational attainment and factoring it by your parents' socioeconomic status and your level of poverty, and then things like race is a factor and sex and gender are factors. Why are women getting more college degrees than men in modern times? Is that because women's rights has increased? Many great questions to be asking. But again, if we just bounce back and forth, health and healthcare, who has more access to healthcare? In America, we have a privatized healthcare system. So therefore, those who don't have as much money don't have as good of access to healthcare, and is that associated with how long people live? And so when you apply age and healthcare and socioeconomic status and address it as a social problem, you're going to find that how long you live is associated with your access to healthcare, for example. So hopefully you guys are getting a quick impression of how complex sociology can be, because it really requires taking all of these different variables and putting them all together to make sense of how groups of people, the study of society, right? To make sense of society, we have to consider all of these variables. And so now if we're going to look at social problems that affect society, again, we need to be thinking about all these variables: culture and socialization and the groups you belong to, and social stratification and social institutions and social behavior. But on top of that, we need to understand the history. How did we get here? Where are we going? Political science. How does the government work? How is it structured? Anthropology. How do people interact? What is people's common ways of life? Culture. We're going to need to understand biology and psychology. How is psychology associated with unemployment? Is the mental facilities of an individual associated with whether or not they can get a job, for example? And then how are, the structure of your brain, how is that influenced by the social context? Because it is. Again, the society you live in is associated with not only the way you think and behave and the cultures you identify, etc., but it's completely associated with the actual structure of your brain and the functioning of your body. So again, overall, we will take a biopsychosocial approach to social problems because we need to be considering biology and psychological factors and sociological factors when it comes to addressing social problems. But in order to do that, to understand all things people and all things in life in general, we need to think about a lot of stuff. So when it comes to defining a social problem, again, there's this objective component and the subjective component. All of life is subjective in that we can't actually get out of our head. Aside from that, through social interaction, we can objectively come together as a society, groups of people, and decide for ourselves what is a social problem. But again, groups of people is nothing more than individuals and their subjective perceptions of what a social problem is, okay? So again, think about a democracy or just a general society. It's a bunch of people coming together with all these diverse opinions, and then we all get together and we come up with an objective approach to defining what a social problem is, operationalizing it, and then going out and studying it and trying to find ways to improve life, okay? How do we know if a social problem has negative consequences? Again, this all comes down to what we perceive has negative consequences, okay? It's a social perception. It's a reciprocal typification. Two or more people getting together and deciding, yes, this is a social problem. We should address it. However, what is a social problem is often debated. So for example, climate change is, you've heard a lot of back and forth on climate change. I've heard arguments like a volcano puts more pollutants into the atmosphere than cars. Yes, that might be true, but we also are affecting the environment with cars, okay? With cattle, okay? With polluting the water, okay? So again, how we define the effects of climate change and is again that subjective, and then we all get together and we all debate it and we all argue it, and then hopefully we can all come to some kind of a consensus as to whether or not it's a problem and should we address it or not. And the book talks about things like sexual violence, rape, and women's inequality. And again, I should put a disclaimer on this class in that, yes, when we're talking about social problems, there's also a lot of dark sides to what we're talking about. A lot of it's hard to talk about. When we start talking about things like rape and sexual violence, it's a very dark subject. But if we don't talk about it, then how are we ever going to address the problem to come up with the solution to make life better for all women on the planet? Because the book is very clear. It says sexual violence, rape, and women's inequality has been around for, thousands and thousands of years. But it's only in modern times, not even globally, that we've addressed this idea of women's rights and protecting women from sexual violence. But even still, 1 in 3 women experience sexual violence in their lifetime. Is it getting better as we address the social problem and we make it known that this is a problem and we should do something about it? Yes, it's getting better, but the problem hasn't solved. And the book even says it wasn't really until after the 1970s that that kind of thing became defined as a social problem. I grew up in Tennessee where it was legal to rape your wife. And a lot of those laws have since been overturned, but that's the point. We addressed it as domestic violence is bad. It's no longer acceptable. This thing that you could beat your children is no longer acceptable. But back in the day, that was the norm. And so again, how did a child abuse, which we define as child abuse, historically wasn't defined as child abuse? But at what point did we as a society decide that it's a social problem? And that's why, it's a subjective versus objective, very interesting approach to studying social problems, is the idea that social problems are socially constructed through interacting with other people and operationalizing these variables. This is how we define something as a social problem and address it. Your book is going to be applying the theories throughout this class. So again, we need a basic understanding of the sociological theories. So the functionalist theory states that all institutions structure the whole. Therefore, the education system serves a purpose to educate and filter people. The government serves a purpose to structure our lives, to create laws. The media serves a purpose to disseminate information. The family serves a purpose for socialization and caretaking and all the other support that we might need. And so again, functionalism then says all institutions are interrelated, meaning that if the economy goes bad, that affects the family, okay? Institutions are not just things like the education system, the government, the media, religion, culture. It's also value systems, non-material culture, for example. Like race is an institution of society, something that was socially constructed by Europeans to divide society into rich and poor. Those that were from Europe were labeled white. Those who were not from Europe were labeled non-white. And non-whites were not allowed to compete in the economic system. Therefore, they were subjugated into the lower classes. Therefore, non-whites had higher rates of poverty and experienced things like racism and ethnocentrism. But again, who does the dividing of society into rich and poor serve? What's the function of that? There are some functions to inequalities, such as incentivizing. But again, at what point does inequality between rich and poor become so great that it's a social problem, such as with the workers' rights movements of the late 1800s and early 1900s? Conflict theory is going to look at how groups compete with other groups, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Yes, the bourgeoisie establishing a system of inequality in the United States, for example, enabled white males, European descendant males, to conquer and to take elite social positions. Okay, but that caused conflict between the lower classes, the non-whites and the working poor, and females. And so over time, we've addressed those through the civil rights movements and the workers' rights movements to reduce conflict in society, because when you start to compare functionalism and conflict theory, some conflict creates so much dysfunction that society has to update in order for it to function again. And then symbolic interactionism says we're the ones who created this society. We're the ones socially constructing a world that is based upon technology, that relies on cars, that has designed our cities around cars, that is expanding and taking over the land, for example. Maybe we should construct a society that is more pedestrian friendly, that is more urbanized, so that we don't have the urban sprawl, so that more of the land is, for the deer and the antelopes. Okay? But again, that's the idea. We're the one who created this society. We're the ones who create the factories that pollute the waters. We're the one who created a society where men have been engaging in sexual violence against women for thousands of years. We're also the ones who can fix that society and make it better. I have a daughter. It's a major concern. So, again, these are the things we need to be thinking about. We're the ones who come up with these value systems, these cultural ways of life, okay? We're the ones who created a system of inequitabilities where some people are in poverty and some people have $26 million mansions in Aspen, Colorado. And then a social constructionist view and looks, again, it's just like a branch, of looking at symbolic interactionism, and is that this world is socially constructed. Our language and the meanings we attach to words and the meanings we attach to constructs and the way we create society is socially constructed by interacting with each other. And then again, the historical perspective of how did we get here in the first place? Who made this society? Who came up with a racist, sexist, ethnocentrist, heterosexist society? Okay? Who came up with the society where the sheriffs were lynching African Americans with the white mobs just because an African American was confident that day? And at what point did we decide that's unacceptable? And that's why I always credit Lyndon Johnson, because John F. Kennedy was going to do it, got shot. Lyndon Johnson came through and said, I'm going to finish this, a Texas white Southerner. Got all the other racist white Southerners to vote. And we had the civil rights movement. But that didn't end racism. It still continues to this day. Just because women have rights in modern times, sexism still exists. They're still paid less. They still experience violence. Okay, so again, we need to know how we got here. So in this class, we're going to be talking a lot about biology. Just to disprove that you're white or black or Asian, I have to be able to looking at genetics. Just to talk about water pollution and things, I have to talk about biology. We're going to be talking a lot about psychological factors of social problems. It's us that determines it, but how much do we have individual control over things? And then sociological factors, all the variables that we've mentioned so far, to be able to understand reality, society, groups of people, and how things work. So again, here's just a quick overview of your major theories. Again, functionalism really focus on the stability of society and how all institutions contribute to the whole. Conflict theory talks about inequality between groups, and symbolic interactionism is the idea that we construct society by interacting symbolically, symbols meaning language, with each other. The natural history of a social problem. The book talks about the 4 stages of the defining or determining or socially constructing or coming up with the perspective that something is a social problem. It talks about the emergence of the problem and how it starts to have negative consequences. It talks about the legitimacy of the problem, of how problems become supported by systems and structures such as government bureaucracy. Renewed claims making, again, this as we slowly, the concept emerges over time and it becomes legitimate, the meanings fluctuate over time, so we're constantly applying meanings to the social change and to the social problem, and also developing alternative strategies to manage social problems to improve the livelihood of all. Continuity and change in social problems. The book talks about continuity of the attributes of a social change, that it persists over time, and that the idea of change, that social change is possible. So when we are confronted with social problems that are persistent over time, there is something that we can do about it by coming together as a group, symbolically interacting, socially constructing, and defining something as a problem, studying it, and coming up with methods to fix the problem. But again, how we approach it, whether or not we succeed in fixing it, is all based upon structural factors. Not only in institution structuring, but also changing the hearts and minds of the individuals that make up society, the group of people, right? And you can see this right now with climate change. We know we're facing problems, yet last year, our emissions actually increased in the United States. So despite our awareness that something is causing detrimental harm, and that we're not only harming, the water and the plants and the animals of the earth, but we're also harming ourselves through climate change, still, what are we doing about it? And so again, how we approach it and how we fix these problems sometimes can be really relatively easy changes, like stop using plastic Coke bottles. Just make a law that says it's illegal to make plastic Coke bottles. Bam, maybe that'll reduce plastic in the oceans, for example. But in order to do that, we have to get to the politicians, but the politicians are paid by Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola is a corporation, a capitalist system, making money and buy the plastic bottles. So are they willing to give up the plastic bottles? And then how do we get to the politicians to get them to pass the laws when they're paid for by the corporations? So again, you get into all these interesting quandaries, and then maybe it would just take us hiring politicians that don't work for corporations, because they don't need millions and millions of dollars just to get elected, for example. Okay, again, these are just random ideas. I will never have a personal opinion, ever. This is just pure observation, looking at patterns, and that's what we're talking about in sociology. When we do research, again, we always remove our personal bias. We always just look at it as scientists. I mean, again, all life is subjective. Everything is subjective to my own personal interpretation, but still, you want to remove your personal opinions on stuff. We're just here to relay the information. That's my job as a sociologist, and try to, as a basic, for research sake, just for knowledge sake, and also as an applied sociologist, to go out and address social problems. Again, there's many ways to engage in research in social problems. We can go out and do surveys, questionnaires, open-ended or closed-ended questionnaires that go out and get us information that can be quantified or can be coded for common themes, for example. We can do experiments whenever possible. Those are often hard to do when it comes to the social context, because control and manipulation are often, and random assignment can also be very difficult. But if that's possible, we'll do that. Observation research, simply going out into the world and engaging in ethnographic or phenomenological research, using existing data, archival data, statistical analysis. These are just a few methods of ways of going out and studying society from a social behavior perspective. But again, it's very important from a sociologist to go and then find out what the biologists are saying. Even though a sociologist might not understand all the biology behind everything, still, we need to go ask the biologist, tell us about climate change. What are you finding? So that we can then take that information and then apply that to the social context to actually maybe do something about that, And so again, we need to be looking at all the sciences and all the arts to be able to understand these social problems. But these are just a couple of quick methods just to be able to do some research, okay? So again, I hope from this lecture you're starting to see that what we're about to study in this class is a huge range of topics. We're taking a sociological perspective, which again, as much as possible, taking both a macro and micro approach to studying society, groups of people. But in order to understand groups of people, we need to be looking at not only the social context, but also the psychological factors, and also all the biology that we can get our hands on. Because again, when we go to talk about race and sex and gender, we need to understand the biology of the body and genetics just to talk about whether or not someone's actually white or black, or whether or not males and females are actually different. And we need the biologists for that. We need a biologist to go out and find out about the water and pollution and things along those lines. We need the sociologists to talk about, how do our institutions like the economy and the family structure our lives. We need the family studies. We need the economists to teach us about capitalism and the functioning of the markets. So again, it's an incredibly diverse class. A good plan, though, for this class is just really start thinking about some of the things that are most interesting to you and start honing in on that, so you can focus on that for your annotated bibliography that we're going to go over and our final project in this class. Thank you so much.